Hello and welcome to a special panel edition of the Amplifying Scientific Innovation video podcast that will focus on innovative approaches for optimizing clinical trial diversity. I'm your host and moderator, Dr. Sophia Ononye-Onyia, founder and CEO of the Sophia Consulting Firm, a life science marketing and communications consultancy that was established in New York City with the goal of amplifying scientific innovation. This week is an exciting one for the life science industry because of the JPM Healthcare Conference, which is the largest and most informative healthcare investment symposium in the industry. Today, I am joined by an esteemed partner that will highlight the need for sustainability in clinical trial diversity and share innovative approaches and emerging tools that will help to optimize patient recruitment and engagement. So let's meet the panel. Dr. Craig Tendler is the VP of Clinical Development and Global Medical Affairs, Oncology at Janssen Research and Development, LLC, one of the Janssen pharmaceutical companies of Johnson & Johnson. Mr. Brian Loew is the CEO of Inspire, an organization he created with the goal of accelerating clinical trial recruitment through the use of safe, trusted, online social networks organized by medical conditions for patients and their caregivers. Ms. Kimberly Richardson is a 7-year survivor of ovarian cancer who was recently diagnosed with triple-positive breast cancer. She has served in prominent advocacy roles with organizations such as the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance, OCRA, and most recently, she is supporting the development of the Survivors Advising Scientists Educational Program, SASEP. Dr. Carmen Guerra is an associate professor of medicine, vice chair of diversity and inclusion in the Department of Medicine, and associate director of the diversity and outreach at the Abramson Cancer Center, ACC, at the Perelman School of Medicine, University of Pennsylvania, UPenn. Her research interests focus on better understanding and eliminating barriers to accessing cancer screening tests and cancer treatment in clinical trials. Dr. Del Smith is the co-founder and CEO of Acclinate, a trusted digital health company integrating culture and technology to educate and engage diverse individuals to make informed decisions about clinical trial participation. Welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
Great, it's an honor and pleasure to have you all on the show. So our first topic for today is the need for sustainability in clinical trial diversity. Notably, cancer is the second leading cause of death in the US and a major cause of death worldwide. Yet, despite poorer survival rates and higher mortality rates for African Americans relative to white Americans, a recent World Cancer Research Network study demonstrated that less than 1 in 4 of pharmaceutical company-sponsored trials are African American cancer patients. Furthermore, systemic institutional and structural racism plays a significant role in the underrepresentation of African Americans in clinical studies. Also, many African Americans do not trust clinical trials due to concerns about previous unethical practices, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study. Starting with Kimberly and then Carmen, what can the life science industry do to improve trust in African American communities with regard to clinical trials? Should the focus be on peer-to-peer education, physician education, both, or even something else entirely? Ms. Kimberly Richardson, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on the panel and giving me the opportunity to share the patient perspective.
My pleasure.
I'm going to speak largely from my own experience over the last 8 years as a cancer patient. And to address your question briefly, is to just to say that we probably need to do more with physician education. I think there's an extreme connect between what patients learn through their physicians about clinical trials. And I won't take away anything about the mistrust narrative, but when we actually have to go to the doctor, and particularly if we've been diagnosed with a cancer, In my opinion and in my experience, I was never given any information about clinical trials. So I'm more of the narrative of we don't participate because we've not been asked.
That is really a powerful statement, and I appreciate your very candid and insightful response. Carmen, I'm going to ask you the same question. As a reminder for the audience, the question is, what can the life science industry do to improve trust in African-American communities with regard to clinical trials?
I agree with Ms. Richardson. I think there is science that shows that when patients, whatever their background is, are offered the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, they participate. And again, I don't want to minimize the trust issues, but I think that that's a very important fact, and I fully agree. But in addition to that, I would say that when there are trust issues, and they exist, individuals may be distrustful of whether it's industry or government or even just healthcare in general. There is a lot to be said for being able to trust a physician that looks like you. So I would say, in addition, having a workforce that represents the patients that we care for would be a very wise investment for us in the long term. To start now, because that's going to take a long time. But I think in the shorter term, there are things that we can do to increase awareness about cancer clinical trials. And you mentioned peer-to-peer, and that's something that we're going to begin to explore. Can you train a layperson, perhaps someone who's had cancer or even participated in a clinical trial, to speak to others who might be eligible for a clinical trial? And having that ability to ask questions that patients might be afraid to ask people of authority, like physicians, I think could be another potential instrument. And the last thing I'll add is that, you know, there are out-of-pocket costs that individuals have related to participating in a clinical trial. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to those. Those include things like travel-related costs, parking, gas money, tolls. And so I think paying attention to those costs and being able to provide resources to help our patients be able to access clinical trials, I think would also be important.
Thank you for those valuable insights, Carmen. And Kim, I wonder if, based on her comments around out-of-pocket costs, do you have any personal insights that you could share with us about that specifically?
I do, and I tend to sort of differ on that because as many panels as I've been on with pharma, with clinical investigators, they don't tend to tell me that that's the issue. They don't tend to say that they have money for transportation vouchers. They have money for childcare and all incidental costs. And so once again, we have a communication disconnect between the provider and the clinical sites and what they can and cannot offer to volunteers in a clinical trial. So I think that it's always going to be those levels of disconnect between what narrative we want to place around Blacks and people of color not participating in clinical trials. Again, my strongest, argument is we need to be asked, right? We need to be participating.
Very powerful statement from you. And I cannot wait for us to start to talk about solutions. But if we switch gears briefly to you, Dale, based on your company's focus on clinical genetics for the purpose of reducing health disparities, why do you think clinical trial diversity is still problematic? And what is a realistic timeline for an at least 50% improvement in diverse patient data?
Yeah. It's a great question. We know that this is a complicated issue, so I don't want to make it seem like it's simplistic. But I think part of the issue is we're treating clinical trial diversity as transactional in nature when it's really relational. And that's what I mean is we have, CROs and investigators and farmers saying, I need you to be part of my trial. Well, for individuals living their day-to-day lives, that's a transactional type of interface. And I think what we need to do is go upstream more, and we need to think about this issue of trust that everybody keeps saying. We had one word to describe why is this a big issue, and you only had one word. I don't think you'd say transportation costs. I don't think you maybe even would say information and knowledge about trials, which I know that's been presented. I think trust is why we have what we have. And so if you think about trust, it's not dichotomous, either you trust or you don't. We talk about mistrust often, right? But trust is a degree of trust. I think we have to think about how do we go upstream and start creating relationships, not transactions, with diverse individuals so that we can increase the degrees of trust that people have. Because once you get to a certain degree of trust, someone will say, okay, I'm willing to take part or learn more. And the last point I'll make about this too is we have to think about this difference between cognitive trust and affective. You know, cognitive trust is like, if I just give you more information about the trial, you'll eventually say, I want to do this trial. But the affective element is this: I need to know your motivations. I need to know that you care. I need to know that we have a relationship. And so I think some of our mechanisms and paradigms that we have need to look at how do we go upstream? How do we build greater trust, and how we do this in a way that's not transactional and relational? And how do we take into account the affective element of this as well too, and not just information?
That's, I mean, I could start clapping at this point, but that would be premature. So I think you have really outlined what the critical issues are. Now, I'm curious to know the follow-up question around a realistic timeline for an at least 50% improvement of diverse patient data. Are you thinking 5 years or even 50 years from now? Is this a problem that could be solved practically?
I think it's definitely a practical issue that can be solved. I think until we see the regulatory environment change, and specifically by that, the FDA coming with stronger requirements for pharma and CRO to diversify their trials, we're not going to see that 50% improvement. But I think if we saw the FDA make this stance and come out maybe in a next administration and say, pharmaceutical companies, your drug that you're spending billions of dollars on will not be approved unless you can show us a representative sample of diversity in your trials, then I think the needle will move. And I think probably we'll see within the next year to 2 years, significant changes in those numbers. But I think regulation is the key.
No, I appreciate your response, because as we've seen, even with the COVID-19 trials, the regulators play such an important role in not just expediting the process, but also making sure that the requirements include a diverse population. So thank you for highlighting that. And it's interesting that we brought up the FDA, because we know that a multi-stakeholder approach is a crucial component of the FDA Office of Minority Health and Health Equity's mission to promote and protect the health of diverse populations through research and communication of science that addresses health disparities. Focusing on research, the next question is for you, Craig. Can you please share some examples of recent collaborations at Janssen that is focused on reducing disparities in patient identification and clinical trial recruitment? In your opinion, how sustainable are some of these initiatives?
Thank you, Sophia, for inviting me to the forum today. And also it's very enlightening to hear the feedback from, of course, people who are dealing with this every day, like Ms. Richardson and some of the other folks you have on the panel. I would say one of the most important things that I've heard so far is that, and we agree with at Janssen, it is a multifactorial issue. And I'll share with you some of the ways that we're addressing it to really start to build a model that is sustainable, so that we're not talking about how do we do it for study X, Y, or Z, but how do we integrate a minority, a real strategy for minority enrollment across all of our development programs. And I think Carmen alluded to this. It does start with having a cadre, a consortium of minority investigators that we are partnering with. It is very important when people are facing doctors that are looking like themselves, have their background, understand their culture. And we feel that it's very, very important to build that sort of coalition of minority investigators, in this case, oncology investigators. So we are partnering with some of our oncology medical societies, ACR, ASCO, both to support their educational programs for developing those individuals, but also partnerships between Janssen and that coalition that we've established to try to make sure that they're aware of our trials, that we understand what sort of support they need to conduct our company-sponsored trials in oncology, and continue to engage them as real participants in our development program. So that's one specific initiative. The second one is around working more closely with sites that are two types of sites. Ones that are new, that we know where, through data science and other information, that we know that these are the large centers that care for minority patients, including African Americans, patients of color that have cancer. Typically, they're not the sites that the major oncology companies go to do their trials. That's our fault. We own that. But now we have a specific initiative underway to work more closely with VA centers, which we know are more representative of minority populations, with centers like Grady Hospital in Atlanta, Parkland Hospital in Dallas, where, again, traditionally these have not been centers that have had access to clinical trials, but they are providing most of the care for the patients with cancer. And then the third piece I think is also very important, and we've talked about it already, is what can we do to really take any of the obstacles, the patient-related obstacles, off the table. And it's true that travel may not be a sole problem, or out-of-pocket costs may not be a problem for a large proportion of minority patients thinking about trials. But we do know in our own trials, we do unfortunately have a bias, which is created by the way the contracting is done, that makes it more difficult for patients who are uninsured or underinsured to participate. And so we have to take that issue off the table by providing modified clinical trial agreements that cover all costs, not just the research costs of the studies. So those are some of the collaborations and the initiatives that we're taking to, as I said, not just start with a model for today, but for building something that's sustainable, so that in every one of our programs, we are pulling the levers on all three of these initiatives to hopefully really move the needle and increase minority participation in our trials.
I really love the multifactorial and multi-stakeholder approach that you have taken at Janssen to provide sustainable solutions. I would personally add that sustainability, to me, this has been a year where a lot of dynamics in terms of race relations has really evolved within the industry, and to know that this is something that Janssen plans to address, not just now but in the future, is something I'm 100% sure that our audience will be happy to hear. So thank you for sharing those insights, Craig. And last but definitely not the least, I'd like to hear from you, Brian, on the types of collaborations that you're forging at Inspire to ensure that no patients are left behind in clinical trials, not just now, but for the future as well.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for putting this together. It's great to be here and great to meet everyone on the panel. We begin with the patient engagement. So members join, and we call them members because many people don't like to describe themselves as a patient, right? So core to what we do is this idea of respect and respecting members' desires and willingness and interest in participating. So the community has about 2.25 million members crossing all therapeutic areas. I was really struck by a comment that Del made about trust. We think of trust as something that evolves. As Del pointed out, it's not binary, yes or no. And it's also something that has to be earned. You can't say, trust me. Instead, you have to demonstrate that you're doing things that lead people to want to trust you. It's interesting when it comes to a comment that Kim made about these gaps in information. We see that all over the place. And one of the areas that we see that is in patient education, where it seems that a lot of the materials that are presented or made available to patients or prospective participants are written at this consistent, very low level. And what we often find is that if you're a patient trying to educate yourself about a trial or about a new drug or anything, you're stuck with either this 5th or 7th grade reading level or really hardcore academic scientific papers, and there's nothing in between.
Wow.
And you can find this out really quickly if you Google something, right? And you see a ton of stuff written at a 6th grade reading level, or you're looking at PubMed. And I would urge pharma and others to create materials at a sort of in-between level. But I think, my experience is that industry is really well-meaning, and that kind of, as Craig was describing, there's a huge desire on the part of companies to create really, good materials and good onboarding. but in some cases, talking to the patients themselves would happen a lot. There's still a real, in all areas in clinical development, there's still, I think, not enough patient engagement. If you look at protocol design, many trials now still don't involve patients in clinical trial protocol design. And when I've talked to people at CROs and others about it, the comment is that, well, customers don't want to pay for it. It's low on the list. And so I think some trials are designed in a sort of ivory tower without involving the kind of patient perspectives that would help a lot.
Thank you for explicitly outlining those issues. I saw everyone nodding vigorously while you were speaking, which is always a step in the right direction. Now, can you provide some collaborations at Inspire that you are thinking about, or actually that you've completed, that is helping to address some of these issues?
Well, we work with industry to help find patients to participate. One thing that I actually wish we had done a better job of at Inspire. When we created Inspire 15 years ago, we initially asked no questions about ethnicity. And in a sort of naive way, we thought that it was rude, right? This was not a question you would ask of someone. It was presumptuous to ask them that. And what's the point? And I think now, of course, even though we asked for age and gender and zip code and lots of detailed medical information, we didn't ask about the ethnicity. We changed that. And the question, we had a lot of internal discussions. And Inspire is a very diverse workforce, which is good. We had a lot of perspectives on this. But the question was, what's the right way to ask this question? And I think a lot of, one of our patient advocacy partners is Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network, and the executive director is Andrea Maddox-Smith. And, I talked to her about it, and she's African-American, and she said, go with the science, right? The reason you're asking someone for their ethnicity in this case is because of the science, that there are real differences among populations, and that the best way to respect members is to describe why you're asking the question. So we've kind of taken that to heart and built that into that. And so every time we ask a personal question like that, we try to give the reason that we're asking, and we still make it an optional question. We found that contributes a lot to willingness to share.
Okay, well, I really appreciate the robustness of your response. And one of the things that stood out to me is the evolution of sort of your approach at Inspire. And that shows that, to the point that Kim made earlier, that you're listening, you're paying attention to the dynamics, and you're doing something about it. So before we switch gears to the next section, I just wanted to open the floor to any of our panelists to see if there's anything that they would like to comment on, respond on, before we move on.
I do, actually. Okay. If I may. Just a quick comment to both Brian and to Craig. Brian, when I was first diagnosed with ovarian cancer, I was diagnosed with a very, a subtype, a rare form of ovarian cancer. And it wasn't very much on the internet about granulosa cell tumor. But what I did find was Inspire.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And that opened up a doorway for me to meet so many more ovarian cancer survivors, to meet granulosa cell tumor ovarian cancer survivors, and to find my way into patient advocacy. So I want to tell you thank you. And then to Craig, I also want to say, in terms of for Janssen, 2 years ago, I met with some of your staff at the University of Illinois Cancer Center, and we talked about this concept around minority participation in clinical trials. And Cassandra was there, and she leaned in and wanted to hear and wanted to understand. And to that degree, with all those cancer survivors sitting around the table, we were able to develop a program where we went directly into the community with FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence, with Chicago-based oncologists, and we went directly into the community, right? And we used this sort of software solution that asks questions right on the spot. It's called Slido. And we went and we asked all those questions about mistrust and would you participate in a clinical trial? And the information that both Janssen as well as FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence got back was that, yes, we understand precision medicine. Yes, we would participate despite what we have understood about Tuskegee's experiment and Henrietta Lacks. And yes, we have the capacity to tell our families and to spread the word about participating in clinical trials. And so we need to lean in and do a deeper dive with the minority populations and not come to the table with assumptions about what they understand about the science. Thank you.
Extremely well said. I think that we could all agree with you, and I applaud your bravery and your candor in sharing your story with the world. I think it makes you bigger than cancer. It makes you someone that we can all look up to and say that if she can manage all these challenges and still have a beautiful smile on her face, then who are we to complain about the little problems that we have each day? So thank you so much for sharing your story. My pleasure. So now that we've mapped out some of the underlying issues, including trust, we are now going to focus on the next topic, which is managing cancer and rare disease clinical trials amid COVID-19. Here we'll also be highlighting innovative approaches and emerging tools in virtual and remote clinical trials. My next question is for you, Craig. Janssen recently headlined the American Society of Hematology ASH annual meeting with more than 35 presentations highlighting the company's deep, diverse oncology pipeline and portfolio. Can you share some innovative approaches that Janssen is adopting either through digital technologies or other methods that will help to increase the amount of clinical trial data available on racial and ethnic minorities?
I think the digital technology is definitely exploding, and we have a large commitment to data sciences and collaborating with data science providers that actually begin to provide some very, very useful information in terms of a lot about how the minority populations are being treated for standard types of hematologic malignancies, in this case myeloma. And what we find is, unfortunately, and this gets to the real injustice and really the inhumanity of this, so we find is that a high proportion, especially in the African-American community that have more aggressive forms of multiple myeloma, are not getting the standard of care treatments, are not being treated as per the approved guidelines. And so we're using this information now to say, where are they being treated, which centers are they going to, and again, can this now inform strategies to work with investigators in these centers? And so at least on our trials, when they participate on our trials, even if they're randomized to the standard of care arm, that standard of care arm is the best current treatment available. So at the very least, we're going to improve, outcomes for these patient populations who are not getting the standard of care regimens, that they should be getting today. And these represent, our control arms of our most important trials. And then hopefully we're able to demonstrate the improved outcomes for patients who are getting the investigational agents. I'll also say that many of the institutions are developing their own approaches with outreach and using digital technologies. And we are working now with many of the larger cancer centers that have had specific outreach programs into their, let's just say their more distant communities, typically the major cancer centers in the major city. But again, when you see the patients who are coming to that center and are going on clinical trials, it's a very homogeneous, usually Caucasian population and not representative of the US population. But now as we go more into the satellite centers where these major cancer centers are building infrastructure, putting up sites, that's an opportunity for us in the community to have outreach programs and to begin to offer the clinical trials, to those patients being treated now in those satellite sites. So that's another big area where the technology is helping us not only identify those locations where the patients are treated, but work with the major cancer centers to build out the right outreach and the right infrastructure to be able to now include those patients in clinical trials, or at least offer them the access to those clinical trials.
I think that's extremely well said. Thank you for sharing the perspective. I like the evolutionary piece. Again, I like the focus on diversity, and I like thinking about ways that companies, to the points that were made earlier, that you're listening and you're engaging and you're improving clinical trial protocols to make sure that diverse patient data can be collected. So thank you for sharing those insights. And Brian, now is your turn. How is Inspire addressing the need for clinical trial diversity, and what are some major challenges that you face in your efforts to accelerate medical progress through engaged patients and caregivers in safe, trusted online social networks?
You know, our broad goal is to build the largest population, member population possible, and to do so across as many therapeutic areas. For various reasons, Inspire is particularly strong in oncology and rare disease, large populations in both. I think it's the way that members discover content. There's a lot of organic search and discovery. People find the content written by those before them. With respect to ethnicity and race, we encourage members to join. We try to, I think a lot of it comes back to what we're talking about, trust and reputation, which is that we work very hard to be known as a safe space, a place where members are in control of their own information. We found this with recruiting patients and also with recruiting employees, that the best way to do it is to make yourself known as a place that's good for membership, that respects and supports members, rather than an explicit kind of targeted campaign, because I'm not sure that that really works. I don't think there's a magic or kind of a secret sauce to finding these untapped populations. I think it's more of just being known as a place where people of all ethnicities can go, that's safe and trusted.
Well, that's great. I guess maybe in other words, what are you doing to get your name out there so that people know of Inspire, and patients like Kimberly could maybe find out about it earlier in their patient journey?
Right. Yeah. One of the probably the biggest answer is we partner with national patient advocacy organizations. So we have 110 partners. Names you would know, like Kimberly mentioned the bladder cancer. The Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance. They've changed their name. It's an incredible ovarian cancer community and partner. American Lung Association, Osteoporosis Foundation, many rare disease organizations like the Wilson Disease Association and sarcoidosis and scleroderma and von Hippel-Lindau. Many. And these patient advocacy partners, we provide the community for them within Inspire. And so they promote it and discuss it and share it with their constituents. And that's the number one way that we get the word out. We also encourage members themselves to share information, and some choose to. And then also the content that members share to make public can be discovered through organic search. And so many of our new members discover Inspire by, reading the words that have come, before them.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing those insights. It's appreciated.
Sure.
So I guess my next question is for you, Carmen. I haven't heard your voice in a while. Would love to hear it again. Based on your experiences working with inner city communities in Philadelphia, for example, and your extensive research in health disparities, what are some best practices that biopharmaceutical companies can potentially adopt with regard to promoting health and safety communication to minority populations who often experience low health literacy and or speak English as a second language?
Well, thank you for that question. We started the conversation by talking about just awareness of clinical trials, and in the absence of information, then people sometimes develop misinformation, and that can affect their attitudes towards something. And so if the default is hearing about Tuskegee or Henrietta Lacks or other abuses, before we even educate, have an opportunity to educate, then we're facing a much tougher battle. And so, and thank you for pointing out that, there's a variety of literacy out there, yes. And I think that was Brian's point is, we've hit the two extremes, but working mostly with a lower literacy population for me, there's a lot of barriers that they face, as everyone on this call knows. Talk about informed consents, right? Like how can you overcome those challenges? But if we take it back to the initial piece of awareness, I think that there's so much value in community education and intertwining. What we've done is intertwine clinical trials education in all of the other cancer programs and cancer prevention programs that we do, so that we're planting the seed. Perhaps these are individuals that came to hear about cancer prevention or cancer early detection and screening. They haven't maybe had the opportunity to develop cancer, but if you plant the seed of what a clinical trial is and all the tremendous benefits of a clinical trial, we have a slide where we show in our community, hey, do you know what aspirin is? And do you know what Tylenol is? And everybody, of course, raises their hands, and we tell them, you know, they wouldn't be available to help our pain without a clinical trial. And so people begin to now associate clinical trials as something that actually could potentially help them or help them in the past. And so beginning with a personal connection at first as to how clinical trials has touched each person's life, and to bringing it to a real conversation, bringing it real to how it really is a beneficial thing, you know, begins the conversation, just opens the door. Of course, as soon as we do that, and they hear the word clinical trial, it's like opening up that can of worms about all that they've heard, the misinformation that they've heard. So you can't go out there without being prepared for handling those questions. And then I would say another thing that we have used are just strong community partners. I mean, it sounds like many people on this call have already established, you know, community partners that have been doing this work for a long time. And so that's so helpful, because then it's not up to this person coming in from the institution alone to talk about clinical trials. That person may or may not be trusted. But if you work with trusted partners, the advocates that are out there, you know, like Ms. Richardson, you know, thinking about them rather than about herself, you know, putting their needs ahead of others, then I think you open the door to building a trusting relationship, and that has to be earned with your actions, as was so well said. So I would say that I've seen in the last 2 years more and more attempts to just establish a baseline knowledge about cancer clinical trials. There's so many organizations that are now thinking about this and creating videos to overcome the literacy barriers that you mentioned, Sophia. But you know, Stand Up to Cancer, for example, is one that began to work in this space. And then you know, NCI, as you know, sponsors many clinical trials, and NIH sponsors many clinical trials. I found it interesting that in the last 5 years, they've now required comprehensive cancer centers to devote entire staff to community outreach and engagement. And one of the focus that they're interested in is clinical trials. So NCI has been doing this, NHLBI through their CTSA centers around the country. And so they've been very much investing and requiring NCI comprehensive cancer centers to hire staff that has specific expertise in this arena to go out and engage, inform, make awareness about clinical trials and engage those communities in our research.
Thank you so much. Again, I appreciate the robustness of your response. And one of the things that stood out to me while you were speaking is about the importance of a grassroots approach that involves multiple stakeholders, and also listening to patients first and thinking through on how to communicate health communications in a way that is going to be palatable. It's not going to be too low level, like 6th grade, and it's not going to be PubMed level either, but somewhere in the middle. So thank you for emphasizing that. And now getting back to you, Del, can you provide insights on the role that you think clinical genetics and decentralized clinical trials will play in maximizing patient recruitment and engagement, especially for patients living in rural areas and medically underserved communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to answer that question, Sophia, and then I want to briefly come back to some comments that I've heard before. So when it comes to this issue of diversity in clinical trials and decentralized trials, right? I think you've got two confounding issues. You've got this other aspect of the digital divide and the fact that we have certain communities and certain populations, particularly rural populations, that do not have access to the same levels of technology. And much of this decentralized clinical trial discussion going on right now has to do with the utilization of technology to remove some of these inherent barriers of transportations and so forth. But then you confound that if you introduce solutions that preclude people that don't have the same level of access when it comes to technology. But I will say this though, and I think this current pandemic and telemedicine has shown us that sometimes we think things are greater barriers than what they actually are. And when you actually you kind of push in that direction, it's not as difficult to achieve the outcome as you expect. If we look at the fact that in the US, about 81% of the population has some type of smartphone in their hand, right? 81%, and that number could be higher than that. If you start developing these decentralized trials that utilize, at the very least, mobile applications and the opportunity to leverage that technology, I think you get to the point where you can significantly change the numbers as they currently exist by offering this as a solution. So I think decentralized clinical trials will, if leveraged the right way, will address some of these issues. I do want to come back to this idea, and this may be a little provocative a little bit, but that's kind of how I do. So for those who don't know me, I would posit that in order for us to really move this needle, we need to truly separate education and engagement from recruitment and participation. Those things need to be linked, but to see that site sponsors and CROs and pharmas, frankly, are trying to take on that work of educating and engaging, when you've got people like Brian and Inspire and what they're doing there, and you've got companies like ours, like Acclinate, and our front-end interface is called Now Included. So if you go to nowincluded.com, that's our place where we're engaging with diverse communities, not to bring them into clinical trials, but to help educate and empower them to take control of their health. And our philosophy is that people are educated and engaged to take control of their health, and you present them with the right opportunity for a clinical trial, they're more likely to participate. But if someone never takes part in the trial, for I know Brian and Inspire, or for us in Acclinate and Now Included, they're still valuable to us. We're still engaged. We're still building relationships with them. And so I would posit that maybe we need to take a look at this and maybe say that maybe the best model here isn't one of the site sponsors and the CROs and the pharmas trying to get into the business of education and engagement, but maybe you need to have trusted partners that you connect with in order to do that work. And so, I want to present that. I know it's a little different from what some people are pursuing, but it's just some thoughts I wanted to share.
I personally do not think that what you've said is controversial at all. I do think that sometimes we try to be all things to all people versus making sure that we are tapping into the right resources that can help with the process. So thank you for highlighting those perspectives. I'm sure if Craig or anyone else has anything to add, the floor is open for you as well. Craig, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely essential that we use everyone's best competencies and skill set to address the problem. And what I meant by saying, going out with community outreach programs is that we support the efforts of the site and bringing in other partners like yourself to help us there. I agree, we cannot be the solution, one solo solution for all the problems, but I think where we can provide the support to sort of enable, those levers to be pulled, to be really integrated into the whole solution, I think becomes very, very important. And I know we've even been talking about some very specific, areas where we know, for example, AfricanAmerican population gets information from Black churches, and trying to, again, understand how, again, without sort of putting ourselves in the middle of that, how can we provide the right level of support to facilitate that type of educational or communication that occurs, but maybe can occur even better with the right level of support from a company like Janssen. So I think that's our mindset, but not to the extent that we feel we can fill each of those needs. We can't.
Great.
We get better people to do that. Absolutely.
Great. It seems like we're all in agreement. Thank you for that clarification. Now, switching gears to you, Ms. Richardson, can you provide more insights on the role that cancer patients, survivors, and advocates like yourself can play in increasing overall responsiveness to minority health concerns? Are there any best practices that you could share, especially based on your recent affiliation with the Survivors Advising Scientists Educational Program?
Yes, I think it's really important. I think for one thing, prior to my diagnosis, I was an urban planner. And so I see things a little bit through that lens. And so when we talk about how does pharma or get down to the grassroots level and how that community is defined. And when I think about neighborhoods and I think about the civic relationships between community-based organizations and its residents, I think about all of our community clinics, all of those CBOs or community-based organizations that have a health agenda or health environment, and they're completely being overlooked as clinical trial sites. Instead, what I continue to see is a conversation about, when we talk about patient engagement, we talk about let's go to the Black church. Well, newsflash, everybody ain't that religious, and everybody's not going to church, and everybody doesn't see the church as a trust bearer. But they do see the safety net hospital that they go to as a place where they can trust their physician. And they do see those community-based clinics in the community where they can get adequate health care. These clinics are ghastly underfunded by state levels. So I wanted to mention that as ways to drill down even deeper to where residents actually have trust bearers. And as it relates to what Brian was talking about in terms of patient education, I think what we've done with Survivors Advising Scientists is we've created those training modules that help patients, caregivers, and patient advocates learn more about basic scientific inquiry. And we've done that in a very bidirectional approach by using MD, PhD students who can transfer that knowledge to patients and caregivers and advocates. But at the same time, when we have developed those modules, we ask nationwide for patient advocates to give feedback. Is the information in this module easy to understand? And it was quite an experience for the MD, PhD students to understand what bidirectional relationships actually are like. We tend to think that scientists know it all or our oncologist knows it all, but it's those subtle things that patients can tell you, not only in the development of training modules, but also in the development of a clinical trial design. That sort of input is critically important, that it's shared knowledge and it's based on equity, based on us as a living expert and then as the researcher as a technical expert. Those are the things I think that are going to move the needle in terms of patient engagement and finding ways to truly get to meaningful patient outreach. What does it mean for the average minority who lives in an urban setting to actually be able to go a couple of blocks to a clinical trial and be involved with clinical investigators and staff that they already know? And how well are we going to get that work done over the next couple of years? That's the crucial part.
I love what Kim said. I mean, that's just right on. The idea that one of the things we've found that supports what Kim said is that if you think about someone who's newly diagnosed or with any diagnosis, what we found is humans, we all have maybe 3 categories of needs. The first is emotional support and friends. The next is practical support. How do I deal with my disease? And the third is kind of scientific or medical or educational. And what's interesting is people look to different resources for each of those. And so what we found is people don't look to their peers necessarily for authoritative scientific medical information. They still look to medical experts and doctors there, but there's a whole practical and emotional side to any condition that happens also. And people are smart. They understand kind of when to look to one resource versus another resource and to put it all together. So the idea, I think what Kim's describing is like creating sources of information that are then parallel to the authoritative scientific information seems really useful.
Thank you for adding on to that, Brian. I also agree about sort of the clarity and the futuristic thinking that Kim's insights have provided us. I do think that the multi-stakeholder collaboration that includes students, patients, specialists, whether they're oncologists or whatever the case might be, bringing everyone to the table and having an open and honest dialogue is really the way to go. So I would like to thank you all for the diversity of thought that you have showcased today, and how these insights will help the life science industry to develop innovative approaches that will sustain clinical trial diversity. The final question is simple. Do you have any additional commentary on thoughts that you would like to share with our audience before we wrap? And just a reminder that you have about 1 to 2 minutes each for your response. So this time around, I think we're going to start with you, Brian.
Well, I just want to say first, thank you for putting this together. And I'm also really pleased to meet all the rest of you. This is just a great group. And I hope that, I just want to say to all of you and to anyone else, I'm happy to be available anytime in the future and to talk more. Yeah, I just think the continued message I would have is look to the patients themselves to be part of the conversation, and always include them in development of new ideas, because you'll be amazed at how much kind of wisdom can come from all of us who are dealing with the disease day by day.
Thank you so much, Brian. Knowledge is power indeed, and I think your insights are practical. Next is you, Kim. Do you have any final comments?
Just again, thank you for allowing the patient perspective on this panel. I think our representation matters. And I'm not one for lots of slogans, but I hear all the time, nothing about us without us. And, sometimes those sort of cheesy slogans really are, appropriate. It's truly important to hear from the patients, because in times when the clinical trial industry needs us, we would already have been a partner if you had engaged us much earlier. So I think it's just important to keep this conversation going and to continue to throw out ideas and find different strategies. I think we are beyond discussing the problem, and we need to really start to focus on the solutions, and many of these solutions do come from the top. So it's going to be driven by leadership, and it's going to be incumbent upon leadership to find all of these different partners, whether it's Dell and Brian, or it's at the patient level, or it's even at the neighborhood institution level. It's going to have to be driven by leadership.
Thank you for sharing those insights. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that the whole concept of finding sustainable solutions for clinical trial diversity is a major theme for this third season of the Amplifying Scientific Innovation podcast. So thank you for sharing that. And now to you, Dr. Dell Smith. Would love to hear closing thoughts from you.
Well, again, I want to reiterate the rest of the panel, what they've said in terms of the appreciation, Sophia, for you putting more spotlight on this issue. Particularly with the Amplifying Scientific Innovation series that you have. I just, every time Kim opened up her mouth to say something like ditto, I respect everyone that's here in terms of their respective roles, whether you're representing the medical community or scientific or patient engagement or participant engagement. What Kim has relayed to us, I hope we all take to heart. I will take to heart. Of course, I'll be following up with Kim afterwards so we can have some more discussions. But I think her perspective on this, as being a cancer survivor, as being someone who's developed an expertise in this space, who's working with biopharmas and CROs and consulting, I think she's in the right place. And so the only thing I want to say is go back and listen to everything Kim said, and whatever she said, do it. And we will solve this issue.
Wonderful. Very well put. Thank you so much for that, Dale. Now let's hear from you, Carmen.
Well, thank you again, Sophia, for highlighting this critical, important topic. Clinical trials are vital for hope and inspiration and advancing our humanity forward. And so I couldn't agree more that this is a topic that we need to come back to and continue to focus on, and one that's going to take a village, almost like the microcosm that we see here of all of these different perspectives, but even broader than that, and agreed that the patient is at the center of that village, and everyone is around that patient, helping that patient access and benefit from cancer clinical trials. So I would say that this is a very wonderful time where a lot of people are thinking about this. A lot of people are putting resources, real resources, to achieving change. And, it makes me just want to roll up my sleeves and let's get going. Let's test all these pilots. Let's see what works. Craig talked about some wonderful system changes. I think those are the kinds of changes that also will produce lasting change. So I want to thank everybody here for just being a contributor to that important mission of establishing hope through clinical trials.
Thank you so much. I know you're a huge advocate for diversity and inclusion through the research that you do, and we really do, of course, appreciate your insights. And last but definitely not least, Craig, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I always say at these panels, even though I'm invited to sort of share a certain perspective, I get more out of it by participating than what I've communicated. And certainly here today, that was the case, hearing all of your insights, especially those of Ms. Richardson's. I would also say that one thing that resonates to me, and we heard this very clearly, from Ms. Richardson as well, this is a call to action. Mm-hmm. We've done a lot of research about what the obstacles are, but now it's really up to all of us from all the different, points of participation, the stakeholder views, to really bring the best thinking together and start with implementing action plans. And I believe that because we have such a commitment to this, and I always say it's one of the few things in oncology drug development that everyone agrees on, that we have to make a concerted effort here to change what's been, unfortunately, many, many years of injustice. And so we're all in agreement. We've got the resources now dedicated to this. And I do believe that we will now begin to make progress. Some things will work, other things won't. But each time, I think we're going to get better and better. And it's really incumbent from the pharma point of view, I think, and my other colleagues that are sponsoring trials, to really make sure that each and every one of their development programs have a very comprehensive minority enrollment strategy built in, so that no study can go forward, no development program can go forward without this basic elements integrated into development programs, essential as key study design elements at the same level that we're discussing those things. We should be putting these things in place as well. And that's the way, certainly we're looking at it from Janssen perspective.
Thanks, Craig. I really like that you emphasize that this is indeed a call to action. I think the purpose of my platform is not just to have conversations for the sake of it, but to actually ignite action on the parts of all the relevant stakeholders. And I think that the patient perspective, as we've showcased through the conversation today, emerging technologies like the one that Dell is pioneering, and then the work of patient communities like the one that Brian is leading us, and then the research that someone like Dr. Guerra is working on. It's going to take multiple stakeholders and multi-perspectives to move the needle. So thank you all for taking the time to provide valuable insights on clinical trial diversity and innovative methods that will help to maximize patient recruitment and engagement through approaches such as virtual clinical trials. I look forward to staying in touch and reconnecting on the Amplifying Scientific Innovation platform. So take care all.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.